Hello and welcome to the road to Cape Town. I'm Chris Bishop. The gathering of African leaders and experts from around the world next week for the World Economic Forum Africa meeting in Cape Town. We at CNBC Africa will be covering the debates and view of the day every hour live across the continent of 48 countries. In this program, we need to get a taste of some of the big issues that will be discussed in Cape Town and will affect your lives. The African Continental Free Trade Area that is upon us. What are the benefits? What are the drawbacks? What will it mean for inter-African trade? How can economic policy oil the wheels? What about the huge infrastructure gap? And last but not least, the fourth industrial revolution, how it could disrupt our lives for the worse and for the better. Now with me I have an esteemed panel. I have Theos. He's the MD for Africa of A.T. Kearney. Also, he's the co-chair of the African Regional Business Council for the World Economic Forum. We've got Kirti Nasai. She is the Senior Director for Government Affairs and Policy at Johnson & Johnson. And we have Zuki Siotula, an entrepreneur with an MBA, who's also a WEF young global leader. So let's get straight into it. Starting off with you, Theo. This African free trade area, in some ways, it's a huge, huge opportunity there for the taking. How do you see it?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, it's actually fantastic that we've been able to conclude an agreement that covers the whole of Africa. I think it's something that we've not really been good at historically. But if I look at it from a potential perspective, it's massive potential. If we look at, for example, intra-trade, which it's definitely going to enable a lot more intra-trade. If we compare ourselves on global averages, we are significantly behind other regions and other continents in that we only have, I think, about 12% of our GDPs through intra-trade, with potential to go up to about a benchmark of about 20% globally. So that would have a massive impact in terms of empowering the continent for development. So I think it's a step in the right direction. I think there are some significant barriers still to be overcome. But I think with the agreement in place, at least we know that the intent is strong to try and exploit the opportunity.
And look at, but compare it to others. I mean, Europe 69%, Asia still 59%,
Still 59, yeah.
And there's a lot of work to be done. But Zuki, to you, entrepreneurs, this is a whole barrel of opportunity as well.
Yeah, it's a massive opportunity to invest across different sectors, continentally. South Africa is not growing at the moment, so it's an exciting opportunity to look at going into other countries that are growing at a much faster rate in the rest of Africa. But Chris, it would be amiss for us to just be excited and not think about some of the things that need to be in place. Obviously, the state of infrastructure at the moment is something that is concerning, so we've got to start having very strong conversations about how we focus investment in infrastructure, because that's quite key in terms of industrializing and making sure that we're successful right across. And I think that it will also be important for the governments to actually be not just have this agreement in place, but to actually be focused on implementation. We previously have not been very strong at that. If you look at SADC, you look at the eastern regions, those are some of the things that I see as risks that we need to manage. But it's a massive opportunity that I think we should really take seriously and take advantage of to actually make this continent even more relevant globally.
Kirti, if I turn to you, Johnson & Johnson, your company, you have to move goods up and down this continent. Goods that save lives, drugs that save lives, up and down this continent. How could it change the game for a company like yourself?
It will change it significantly. We are developing vaccines for Ebola and HIV. And so supply chain is going to be critical. And like Zuki was saying, implementation is going to be the critical success factor here. And we are seeing, major supply chain infrastructure deficits, especially when it comes to cold chain infrastructure, as an example. So we've just completed a whole series of cold chain immersions across many different markets to look at what the infrastructure looks like. And there are some major deficits that would need to be addressed there in order to get things like vaccines to people who really need it. The other thing that we would need to look at is harmonization of regulations. So in a sector like the pharmaceutical sector, it's a highly regulated sector. And at the moment, you've got different countries with different standards and different regulations. So it makes companies like ours very difficult to comply with different standards. But we do see that Africa is trying to harmonize those regulations. There is an initiative called the AMRH, the African Medicines Regulation Harmonization Initiative, that is seeking to create one common agency with common standards. So that is a move in the right direction.
But Theo, just mentioned, Zuki just mentioned there about SADC and some of its problems over the last couple of decades, or more than that, the last 30 years. And look at the squabbles that are going on in Europe at the moment over these free trade areas. How likely is it, you think, that Africa can get that kind of harmony that can help goods and services move across borders?
Yeah, I mean, Chris, to be frank, it's a mammoth task. I think, as Nasai was mentioning, there's a lot of harmonization. Africa is not one country. I mean, it's over 50 countries and complex and very difficult, different regulatory regimes. Added to that complexity is you have difficulties in data flows. So to facilitate transactions, you don't have a common platform. So a lot of harmonization is required to actually turn this agreement into something practical. So I think like I said earlier, the agreement is a step in the right direction, but there's a lot of work to be done in respect of harmonizing the infrastructure, making sure that there's a free flow of not just goods, but of information, right? And there's platforms that can facilitate transactions. For example, me buying a bag of coffee in Uganda, I need to have surety that when I do the transaction here, that the fulfillment happens in terms of the commercial aspects, but then the delivery required to make sure that coffee gets to my house.
I mean, because aside from the borders and customs and all the reforms that are needed, also things like repatriation of profits, that sort of stuff.
Exactly. As a really another layer of complexity to making this intent come to life. I mean, as you've mentioned, I think Zuki's mentioned, within the SADC region, you look at common customs unions, and there's all these issues around facilitating free and fair trade, even in sub-regions. At a continental level, that adds another layer of complexity that we need to really get to grips with.
And Zuki, we've already said that entrepreneurs like yourself are going to be in the front line of all of this and testing it out. I mean, how much do you fear that maybe you can go to a country, have a brilliant idea, get the investment, and then people say, sorry, you can't do that in our country here, sorry. It happens.
It does happen, and that's why corporate governance is going to be essential, because if I'm partnering with international investors, that's the first thing that I have to assure them that on the ground, I will be able to make sure that their money actually does come out and that these investments will be profitable. So we're going to have to look at strengthening corporate governance, and corruption is a challenge across many of these countries. So regulation, leadership is essential for us to be able to succeed.
What problems can you foresee with it? I mean, the good thing is it should be easier for you to move your goods all over the continent, but what problems do you foresee?
In terms of
in terms of actually the free trade area, I mean, do you think that you've had a look at it?
Yes, so the harmonization of the regulations, like I said, we are seeing some moves there, but I think we really need to step up the private sector engagement. We are working in a very innovative sector, and I think one of the challenges there is regulators need to keep up with the pace of innovation, and technical capacity also needs to keep up with that level of innovation, and I think that is a major challenge, because we are looking at some major technical capacity challenges amongst regulatory authorities, and the pace of innovation just keeps moving. So I think the level of engagement, if that picks up with the private sector, then we will be able to address those challenges.
Yeah, I mean, you're as you said in the intro, co-chair of the African Regional Business Council. What kind of reservations do they have about this African free trade area?
Well, overall, we're quite optimistic about it. Very, very bullish about what potential it offers, if we can get all the moving parts. I mean, if we put the continent within the global context, you have a global situation that we've described in one of our publications called multi-localism. So there's almost pulling back from globalization drives around the world, and Africa's headed in the opposite direction if you think about it through this agreement, which presents a massive opportunity in terms of stimulating the economic growth. So I, as part of our deliberations within the Regional Business Council, we only see opportunity, and the opportunity to really put a stake in the ground in respect of our positioning on the global stage as we're going counter what's happening around the world. And we're encouraging further sort of global trade. We're encouraging globalization, in effect, when the rest of the world is going to a multi-local environment, which for us is fantastic. If I may just pick up on another point, just on the regulatory side, and just a point that's been mentioned earlier, and how technology is running way ahead of regulation. I see it as a challenge in many respects, but it's a fantastic opportunity, because one of the things that has stopped us as a continent progressing at the rate we need to progress is restrictive regulation, right? And it's been a barrier in many respects. So technology actually provides the opportunity to move quicker, whilst the regulation is trying to catch up. And technology transcends borders. We all know that. So with the kind of technologies we have today, we're really essentially opening up the whole continent as one market. And whilst we wait for the regulation. That being said, we will need enabling regulation at the end of the day, so we can't get away from it. What I think is critical, though, and this is a point I would mention for policymakers, would be to think about a different way of doing policy. Right? You cannot do it the way you used to do it. It just takes too long. 3 years by the time. 3 years is just way too long. Technologies are out in 3 weeks.
Well, we're going to talk about economic policy next, but a question I have for you as the Senior Director for Government Affairs and Policy in your company. This is a fairly bold move for Africa at a time when America is becoming more, shall we say, America first, isolationist. There's trade wars going on. Meanwhile, this continent's opening up to itself. It is fairly bold.
Yes, yes, it is. But like Theo is saying, it provides us with huge opportunities. And, we are making a lot of investments. I think innovation is rife in Africa. And we have launched many innovation challenges in Africa. And actually, at the WEF meeting next week, we will be announcing winners of our latest Africa Innovation Challenge. I think we underestimate the amount of innovation that is taking place in Africa. And I agree with Theo, as much as regulation is a challenge, it also provides us with an opportunity, because African countries do not have to follow the same development trajectory as developed markets. We really have the benefit of technology today that we can leapfrog other developed economies. But the dialogue between the private sector and policymakers really needs to be stepped up. But I think the challenge to us in private sector is we need to create better platforms for dialogue with policymakers, and I think that we are not there yet. In the SADC region, we've just had Industrialization Week in Dar es Salaam recently, where the SADC Business Council was launched. And that is the first regional business council, which is the private sector platform for dialogue at a regional economic community level. And I think we need to see more platforms like that for dialogue with policymakers. And I think that is really going to step up the platform for regulation, for implementation, etc.
Chris, if I may just add, I think there are also basic things that we need to put in place. As an investor, it's important to facilitate free movement amongst all these African countries. We talk about lifting of visas, that has to be quicker. I mean, you have to fly to Dubai just to get back into Africa, to get into a 1-hour meeting. We can't afford those type of things. You need to be nimble in the investment space, and that level of flexibility is going to be key for success. And then secondly, we've got very good institutions, particularly the DFIs, right? So we've got the IDC, the likes of the PICs, the AFDB, And those will also need to be aligned and not continue to work in isolation. The IDC is a fantastic organization, but they, for example, don't have regional offices. And you've got the AFDB that has regional offices. So how do those two come together so that it's easy to deploy capital, but also you can give investors comfort because you have people on the ground, and it'll be easy also to identify strategic partners and be able to execute it with all of this investments that we've raised.
Well, this is moving us on to our next subject. I mean, economic policy. I mean, there's no doubt that economic and politics are intertwined in every nation on earth. The big call at the moment is for governments all over the continent to say hands off and let business do its work. How likely do you think that's going to be, Theo, you think?
My take on that, Chris, is it's not an either or. So it's not hands off and stay away. I think the critical thing to get right is the ideal African private-public partnership model. Right. I think anyone everyone will agree. I think there's general consensus that government will not be able to resolve all the challenges we have. It has to be in partnership with the with the private sector. Right. Now the trick then becomes, how do you create a model that works for the African context, and in terms of the private-public partnership, ensuring that we continue along the kind of trajectory as a continent that we've been on, where democracy has actually been on the right sort of trajectory in respect of our democracy and embedding democracy in our countries. So ultimately, I would say without the private sector, we as part of the critical stakeholder in moving us forward, we don't stand a chance, and we need to be open and honest about that, and there's a role for both public and private sector to play. I would add, though, that the public sector, through the policies, should create policies that enable, not disable. So should be around creating fertile ground for entrepreneurs to do what they can do, right? And not tie their hands up in red tape and all those kind of things.
But that's the thing, Suki. I mean, if you gave me $1 for every speech I've reported on politicians saying, no, entrepreneurs are the future, private money, people risking their money, youth, people like yourself are going to get us out of our economic problems. And yet the same youth have come to me as a journalist and say, look, I'm having a problem with red tape, I can't raise funds, I'm being blocked at every turn. How do governments in Africa approach that one?
I mean, that's going to be critical, and every country is different, right? And they have different regulations. So it's easier to do business, for example, in Rwanda or in Kenya than it is in Burundi, for example. So that's going to have to be looked at very closely. As an entrepreneur, it's very important that you have access to training, your ability to raise capital, and to do that effectively and quite quickly. You find a lot of the DFIs, for example, have funds for youth or for women, but their rate of deployment of that is quite slow, and that's a reflection of that policy and intention are not aligned. So a lot of work is going to have to be done, and ensure that, so not just alignment locally in South Africa, you've got to get alignment across the continent, because I can't promise investors something and then not deliver. So if for example, the clearance, in my understanding, for goods to come that I have ordered is 3 days, I have to deliver on that. And that requires intergovernmental conversations and make sure that there's alignment and ease, and that's not going to be a simple task.
And talking about simple tasks, I mean, the figures from the World Economic Forum are saying by 2050 there's going to be 2.2 billion people on this continent, and half of them are going to live in cities, which are already groaning under the weight of population. Companies like yourself, I mean, how can you prepare for that sort of thing, bearing in mind infrastructure's in short supply?
Yes. So on the issue of entrepreneurs, that's exactly what our innovation challenge is seeking to do. So, I was privileged enough to be a judge on our innovation challenge, and it was really phenomenal to see the kind of innovation that's coming from our African entrepreneurs. So our innovation challenge was really about addressing healthcare challenges, but at the same time coming up with innovations that will eventually become sustainable businesses. And what we are offering is not only funding but also mentorship. Because I think it's fine to have funding, but you also need mentorship to be able to create a sustainable business. And that is essentially what we're offering. And this is not the first innovation challenge that we have launched. We've been doing this since 2016. And we will continue to invest in that. We're also offering training. So we are investing massively in terms of training in Africa, in terms of health workers and so on. Because I think as the population grows, so will the healthcare demands. And we are seeing also a shift in disease burden as the population grows. As populations urbanize, we will see a shift in disease burden. So I think policymakers also need to be prepared for that. And companies like ours also need to be thinking about how we will invest in that.
But Theo, I mean, are policymakers prepared for the massive changes that are going on? I mean, already, according to WEF, we've got 71 cities with more than 750,000 people in, and even then, there's a huge infrastructure gap in terms of looking after people. I mean, even a city like Johannesburg, we can see it every day. How do you think government economic policy can live up to this problem?
Yeah, I think it's a critical challenge that we need to address, and I go back to some of the points that have been mentioned around entrepreneurial activity, but superimposed on that, I would also propose, or at least think that it's worth looking at cities as almost as countries in their own right, and that's really where we're headed to with the massive urbanization. And with the infrastructure backlog. So cities are actually going to become centers of power for driving policy at a national level in many respects, and not the other way around, just because of these trends. What I would add as well, Chris, is you've got, as you mentioned, you've got 2.2 billion people in this continent in the not so distant future, of which half of them will be in the city, of which 400 million of those is going to be the youth. Right? It's going to be the youth.
Oh, yes.
Right? Which in many respects is a tailwind if we look at it from an innovation perspective. You know, where the best idea is going to come from, they're going to come from the young. Right? Yeah. We've already got pretty high entrepreneurial activity rates, I think 13.68% above the global average in terms of entrepreneurial activity in this continent. But we have the highest in terms of discontinuation. Yeah. Which then goes back to the point of being supported from a funding perspective, being enabled, you know, by crowding in all the various stakeholders to give those entrepreneurs a chance. So it's a kind of a tragic situation. Fantastic energy, huge population that can actually, you know, come up with the bright ideas, but they're not being well supported.
Yeah. But that's the point, Suki. I mean, perhaps you can tell us this. What a tremendous opportunity. You've got this huge, as you say, 400 million youth, but there's two sides to that story, in the fact that people with nothing to lose sometimes can be very discontented, as governments around the world are finding. But do you see that spark in the youth of this continent? Do you see it ready to ignite?
You know, Chris, one of the big risks is inequality. And I think across the continent we have that problem. And that could be a threat to all of this free trade. The other aspect of it is that a lot of the economic activity that's happening is also in the informal sector. And in terms of actually expediting this growth in the economy, we've got to be able to put policies and all of the various stakeholders together to say, how do we move these really active people who have the ability to be entrepreneurs from being in the informal sector into the formal sector, and then from the formal sector in your country, then how do we enable you to start trading with other regions and then start talking about taking that business globally? I think that's where the huge potential is. There are so many young people across Africa, and as Theo was saying, that's where the ideas are going to come from, and that's where the future of this continent is dependent on. So every cent should be focused on developing and accelerating those businesses.
And this gap is huge. You know, it's something like 66% of people work in the informal sector in sub-Saharan Africa alone. I mean, companies like yourself, can you make a dent in this at all? I mean, with entrepreneurs and the like, an established company, can you draw more suppliers into the formal sector?
So, you know, like I said, we are trying through these initiatives like the Africa Innovation Challenge. We've had other challenges. Our focus is also really on training frontline health workers. Because we think that we can really make a difference, both in healthcare, but also from an employment perspective, in training healthcare workers. So we have set targets for ourselves that we would like to train 650,000 healthcare workers. That is our 5-year target. And we are well ahead of reaching that target, because we think that not only will we make a difference in those people's lives, but also from a public health perspective, there's a multiplier effect there. And that is really the way we are looking at it.
Do you think that this is the way we talked about public-private participation? What do you think? Do you think it's working? I mean, because is it a lot of companies still see it as not quite their job to create infrastructure and growth and training, that sort of thing. Do you think it's changing that?
I think it is changing, and I'm happy to say this, by the way, because it has to change, right? Private sector doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? They exist in communities, in countries, in society, right? And any business that is not conscious of that reality is actually working against their own objective. So, but I'm happy to say that I think most companies and most organizations in Africa are acutely aware of this and are taking strides to make sure that they are taking a longer term view in respect of developing capability. I mean, we've had, I think in the last decade or so, I mean, we've had innovation hubs popping up from all over the place. Johnson & Johnson's doing some great work. You've got IBM's got innovation hubs coming up. You've got places in Nairobi that are becoming Silicon Valley-esque type stuff. You've got Nigeria where Facebook and Google are opening up offices to train on artificial intelligence. So there is that appreciation that you are intertwined with the society, but also that's a society that creates the talent to feed your engine. You are part and parcel of the same sort of ecosystem. So I guess what I'm saying is I'm seeing that change. Maybe it could be accelerated for sure, and there's always going to be that tension between profit and development and all those kind of things, especially if organizations are driven by listing and profitability, all those kind of things that come into the fore. But I have to say I'm encouraged by some of the steps that I've seen, especially with some of the South African organizations that have taken bold strides to empower the youth.
Suki, what do you say?
If I might just add, I mean, I sit on a number of boards, both in private sector and public sector, and it's very encouraging. I mean, we're having very, very strong and serious conversations around ESG. I think business has woken up to the fact that they will not be sustainable if they don't focus on ESG. In fact, I'll be as bold as to say that they will cease to exist if you don't focus on that. So the need for us to report on that on a continuous basis and benchmark not just locally but internationally is a very positive move, and I would encourage all businesses to focus on that.
And companies like yourself, I mean, you've been with Johnson & Johnson for some time. I mean, have you noticed a sea change in the way directors think about the future and sustainability?
Yes, absolutely. I think there's a lot more investment in local talent and just developing the youth. So we have got a lot of initiatives in terms of looking at, for instance, a focus on women and young girls. So we have a massive focus on the elimination of HIV and AIDS because that is a key focus area for us. And in sub-Saharan Africa, that is the population that is disproportionately impacted. So we're not only looking at the disease, but we're also looking at that population and what we can do in terms of girl empowerment. And I think that will also go a long way in terms of employability, in terms of education, and just the future of that population on the continent. So we are doing that across 10 countries in sub-Saharan Africa currently with partners.
But Theo, is this kind of thing, do you think it's enough what people are doing? I mean, you said there's a sea change, you said there's more investment in the countries where people are operating and in sustainability. Is it enough? How much further could private business go?
I think definitely not enough. I think a lot more could be done. I think it also could be directed more systematically in terms of where the biggest bang for the buck would be in terms of what you'd like to achieve. So, for example, it may make sense to invest in technologies and make them accessible to people to try things out and to get them to practice programming or something that's in demand. Or it may make sense to set up an institution and to build skills and capabilities, which then unlock people to be able to do a lot of things. I think there isn't that kind of alignment on where best to invest, so you can get the biggest return on your investment in respect of empowering entrepreneurs and developing skills such that you can build a sustainable economy and sustainable societies.
Suki, do you think the governments of Africa are still paying lip service to entrepreneurs, or do you think they're being taken seriously?
It's a bit of both. I think that there is positive intention, but the lack of alignment is what's not supporting entrepreneurs to become successful. As Theo mentioned earlier, there's a lot of activity, but we have one of the highest rates of failure. People drop out, businesses fail, and that's really due to the lack of alignment, lack of support, and with regional integration, that's going to be even more critical. So we cannot continue to pay lip service to this anymore. And I suppose the question is, are the politicians actually ready to really combine the political and economic conversation and truly unpack what that means and what's going to have to change in the short term, in the medium term, and in order for us to be successful.
How are you reading that, Kurti? Are other politicians ready, you think, to embrace young, vibrant entrepreneurs leading the way? I mean, I interviewed once the finance minister of Rwanda, and he said, we don't mind if entrepreneurs come in and take over the country as long as it grows. And I said to him, isn't there going to be a tipping point where you maybe feel you're losing control? And he goes, no, as long as it's legal, we don't care. What do you think?
I think, you know, again, it comes back to the enabling environment and implementation. And I think, you know, the policy frameworks need to provide that, and I'm not always convinced that that is the case. Certainly from our perspective, we are doing what we can in terms of our supplier diversity programs. We are very much focused on that, not only in South Africa, but globally. We have a very strong focus on supplier diversity programs, enterprise development programs, and so on. But it is challenging to implement those depending on which markets you're focusing on. And I think, you know, depending on what the policy frameworks are, it can be a bit stifling.
Theo, I mean, one thing, go on.
If I can just add on to this point, because it's been one of my bugbears for a long time in terms of how governments pay lip service in some respects to entrepreneurs. As Zuko was saying, there are things that do, you know, have good intention and so forth. The execution is lacking, but it's actually even worse than that. I actually think they actively work against entrepreneurs in some instances. Yeah. Let me give you an example why I say this. I think, one, there's been persistent problems around the payment terms for entrepreneurs. Right, it's every year. Let's talk about we've got to shorten the cycle times to pay the entrepreneurs because they've got serious cash flow constraints and so forth. But you go to government, it's still, you can wait a year to be paid. Right? Still, as we do. And they talk about this thing every year. So I don't know what's preventing them from addressing that. You talk about tax, and this is something that I've actually experienced in an entrepreneurial venture I was involved in, where in effect, as an entrepreneur, your effective tax is actually higher than a corporate, because corporates, they hire all these fancy tax experts who can come and restructure everything, and they can got all these complex structures where they can transfer price from one country to another, and then their effective tax rate is lower than the country rate, whatever it may be, of 30% or whatever. But as an entrepreneur, you don't have any of those. Take away taxes for entrepreneurs. Well, just say, look, flat, if you've got a startup, it's less than this size, you don't pay any tax.
But this flat rate tax has been talked about for a long time. Everyone said it would stimulate the economy overnight, etc. But I've never heard the tax authorities even considering it. But how could it change the game for entrepreneurs?
It would completely change the game for entrepreneurs, because if you take away that tax burden from them, you're effectively incentivizing entrepreneurs to grow their businesses very quickly. And as those businesses scale up, they create jobs, and it's real jobs, and it's permanent jobs. Right. When you have a country that is estimated to have 50% unemployment amongst the youth, or depending on who you talk to, that is a disaster waiting to happen. And something has to give along the line.
And
I just want to add a point on the payment terms. I think the payment terms in general are a problem. So certainly in the health sector in South Africa, it's been a long-standing problem. And it's not only for small companies, it's also for big businesses, because I think there's a perception that large companies can absorb that deficit because you've got larger cash flows, so you can, you know, live with the debt for a much longer period of time. And smaller companies, like entrepreneurs, literally go bankrupt. And we've seen that happen in South Africa. Certainly in the healthcare sector, we've seen lots of companies, black-owned companies and so on, go under because, you know, public sector has not paid them. But for companies like large multinational companies, the perception has been, well, you can live with that debt for that much longer. And I think it's really a wrong mentality to have that. I think payment terms need to be fair, and they need to be adhered to. And we do have those provisions, even legal provisions, but they're not adhered to, unfortunately.
But there's another case in point for entrepreneurs, Zuki. I mean, a lot of them have come to me down the decades and they say, when I needed a few $100,000 to start my business, all the financial institutions and banks, they told me to take a hike, right? And then when I started making money, I bootstrapped it somehow. Then they came to me asking to lend me money and trying to throw money at me, the money that I wanted 2 years ago that I don't want now. Is that not also a problem with the financial institutions?
It is definitely a problem. And I mean, if I look at in South Africa, just in our context, we're not very good at venture capital. It's actually, I'd go as far as saying it's almost non-existent. Your business gets supported because you have put everything to get it started. I mean, businesses that I've invested in, I've literally had to put in my own equity. Now I'm in a fortunate position that I was able to access that, but most entrepreneurs don't. And it doesn't mean that their ideas are not good, but they need that seed funding initially to get their businesses started. And financial institutions need to start looking at this and saying, how do we actually solve the problem differently? There's also, I was speaking about the informal sector earlier. We have a huge percentage of the entrepreneurs in the informal sector that are unbanked. And we now have technology. So large businesses, financial institutions, telecommunication companies like the likes of MTN and Vodacom, that's a massive opportunity for them to look at, to say, how do we use technology to create a better platform for financial services? How do we use access to data to facilitate business, payments, transactions across the continent? I think that will be a massive opportunity that big business has to look at.
Well, let's also just move on to one of the other big issues. I mean, the infrastructure. I mean, there's a huge gap, an investment gap of $1 trillion just to keep up with the sustainable development goals that have been set for the future. Oh, where's this money going to come from? I'm not asking you personally.
I don't have it, Chris. But this is again something that's been a persistent headwind for the continent. It's been spoken about for a number of decades. We've got this infrastructure backlog and so forth. There's big programs that have been dreamt up, the Grand Inga project in DRC, and it will power the whole nation and so forth. Yet you've still got the lowest penetration of power in the whole world. And you've got, I think, probably an opportunity to, as I said before, you've got to focus, and because if you don't have enough money to do everything, enough funding to do everything, then be very clever around where you target, what's going to unlock the biggest economic stimulus, and then put your investment there. So, for example, we did a study where we analyzed different industry segments. Right, but we did this at a country level, and we probably need to do this at a continental level. But we analyzed different industries, and we applied a model that was actually developed by some economists who won a Nobel Prize for it. So it was kind of well tested, and we plugged in all the figures for a country, and it came out. We were able to identify which industries, if you invest $1, will give you the biggest impact in terms of economic growth and job creation and all those KPIs that we had in that. And it was very interesting for, at least at the country that we did it, that It was, you're actually better off investing in transport because of multiplier effects and creating jobs down the value chain and to reduce the cost of moving of goods and so forth, than you are investing in a new mine.
Yeah. Well,
that kind of thinking. And I don't think the countries have analyzed that enough.
Yeah.
To have that sense of focus to make your limited funds go further. And
well, there's a case in point. I mean, a lot of people complain that this country in particular is stuck in the 80s in the fact when they think about jobs, they say, okay, let's try and get some more mines, let's get some more factories.
Exactly.
But things are changing. I mean, we're talking about the fourth industrial revolution a bit later in the show, but I mean, how is your company approaching this sort of thing?
So talking about industrialization, if we look at the priority sectors in the industrialization strategy, one of the things that I've been talking about is we look at pharmaceuticals and agro-processing, for instance. There are some inputs coming from the agro-processing sector that could go into pharmaceuticals, but we're looking at those sectors in silos. And we should start looking at the synergies between the sectors. And so certainly in my discussions with policymakers, I've been saying to them, why aren't we looking at those synergies between agro-processing and pharmaceuticals, for instance, and looking at the comparative advantages across markets, and starting to look at regional integration from that perspective. Because everyone at the moment in terms of pharmaceuticals is looking at localization, thinking that companies like ours are going to do manufacturing locally. And it's really unrealistic at this point in time to think that there are going to be manufacturing facilities in each and every country. I think we need to start looking at regional integration from a different perspective.
And this infrastructure gap, it can never be underestimated. I remember doing a great story in Mozambique once about how farmers were using computers to check prices and how they could import stuff long ago. I mean, I'm talking about 10, 15 years ago. Yeah. But the only problem was that the actual infrastructure, the computers that they were using were being overrun by sand because there wasn't enough money to actually seal them against the elements. I don't know. I mean, how confident are you that that kind of world-class infrastructure that you need can be built for entrepreneurs in this continent?
Yeah, I think as we look at integration, a key component is that we have to look at each industry per country, and how do we own the whole entire value chain, because then you're able to capture the economics and right across that value chain, and you can actually plan appropriately what's the infrastructure that you need, what's the distribution network, what capital you need in those places. And furthermore, that doesn't need to happen in every single country individually. You can create regional hubs and say, we are going to look at these countries and say, pharma is going to excel along this area, manufacturing will take place, this is distribution, and then we'll be able to have bulk, and then we can look at the export market, and we'll have more negotiation power as a continent versus as individual countries.
Because this is it, isn't this the great promise of the African free trade, back to where we started almost, in the fact that you've got this tremendous muscle. I mean, it's a huge block with something like 1.4 billion people that could all of a sudden be calling the shots around the world. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think we at a critical juncture. That would be the context within which I'd respond to that, in that we're in a world where decisions you make as a country or as a continent have a far bigger impact in terms of your fortunes now than ever in our history, at least, because of just the dynamics of the global world that we're in at this moment. There's a book that's written about it, and as such, we need to make some pretty big trade-offs quickly that could stimulate us to take us to another level very, very quickly, right? But if we don't make those calls, right, it's equally steep going down, and unfortunately, it's just the way it is. I like I said, I like to remain optimistic, and I think we head in the right direction, but we've got to execute, and quickly.
Okay, but last but not least on this program, the fourth industrial revolution, we're all going to be down there in Cape Town. It's something that's been talked about at the World Economic Forum for a number of years, but let's take a quick look at what the fourth industrial revolution actually means at the grassroots among the young of Africa. Now, CNBC Africa went to an exhibition in Gaborone, Botswana, where we found youngsters interacting with robots.
With the fourth industrial revolution in full swing, is Africa's education system left behind? In a recent Innovation for Africa Expo in Botswana, it seems likely that Africa is making great strides in this area with practical applications for robotics in schools.
Fable is a modular robot that is designed for education. What it does is maybe you could, for example, like it could act as a substitute teacher. You could teach students math on an application called Fable Block. So how it works is we have blocks in that application. In that application, those blocks translate into Python language. And then the language is transmitted into these joint modules. These joint modules and then respond to the hub. The hub is the thing that transmits the Python code into the joint module.
So as you can see, this module is moving and it gets command from the PC. These are the blocks that command the module. We're also using it to command this module, and then it also commands the phone and also what we call the spin module, which is like a wheel-like module.
Cubo. This is Cubo. It's like our tiny miniature robot. It's a CAD-based architecture. So it's used for kids who are the age of 8 to 5, but mostly can go over that age. So even adults can even try to play with this. It helps with navigation system and coordination. So it's just a really great way for young kids to start programming. As you can see, every card here has a chip inside, and this little guy has a scanner here. He scans what the chip says and you do what the card is written.
It helps a lot with your navigation and coordination skills in children, especially ages 3, 4, 5. Basic knowledge, right, left, all of those things, and colors also. And the good thing about this thing is that the cards can be placed however way you can, just like she said, yeah.
We're implementing it here around the schools in Botswana because it's not currently been introduced to people in Botswana.
Well, there's the young of Gaborone in Botswana getting to grips with robotics and a little bit of the fourth industrial revolution that Klaus Schwab coined many years ago, and we'll be discussing in Cape Town. The good thing about that is that you've got kids talking about chips and all kinds of things that we would have not even thought about when we were that age. But it seems to me a lot of countries, including this one, it's still only extracurricular activities. It's not actually on the government curriculum yet. I mean, isn't this continent missing a trick there?
Definitely so, Chris. I mean, we've carried out some studies in partnership with the World Economic Forum where we looked at 100 countries around the world, and we did an assessment of what was called Fourth Industrial Revolution Readiness Assessment, right? And there we looked at the structure of industry and we looked at the drivers of industry in respect of then the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And I'm sad to say that the African countries didn't fare well. They all were basically positioned in what we called a nascent quadrant. It's some terminology that we use, which is basically saying that we're not ready for the Fourth Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, but that's a great thing. I mean, how do you see it, Zuki?
We're definitely not ready, and what scares me is that we tend to talk about the Fourth Industrial Revolution as something that's coming, or a strategy that we need to put in place, and you get a sense that, you know, even big business doesn't understand what 4IR is, or even government for that matter. It really worries me that the Minister of Basic Education and Higher Education hasn't, you know, had a sense of urgency around changing the curriculum, because if, you know, 9-year-olds should be able to code in this country. You know, iPads should be available at schools, computers. I was recently involved with the Kgalema Motlanthe Foundation, who had partnered with Microsoft to go and work with schools in Tembisa. to introduce AI to kids, and I was amazed, Chris, at how these kids grasp the concepts very quickly. If they're given the exposure, they have fantastic ideas. But it saddened me that this was only accessible to them after hours and on a weekend. And this is not part of their curriculum. And when you do that over the weekend, kids that come from homes where there isn't money to travel over the weekend for extra things, they don't have basic meals to even, attend. Those are the realities on the ground in the townships. And I mean, I don't even want to imagine when you then look at the rural areas. So we've got to make this quite real. On a lighter note, but that even saddens me, if we take this 4IR so seriously, why is the Wi-Fi at OR Tambo not stable? Why is there no Wi-Fi in the union buildings? Let's make it tangible, a reality. Our mindset has to be there, so that this is something that we're living, we're breathing, and we can actually start to have foresight of what that means. I recently did a visit as well to China and Russia to experience their retail and how that's been transformed by AI and robotics. It's mind-boggling, completely mind-boggling.
And one of the saddest things, you're talking about the classroom there, where we did a piece recently on children in the east of Johannesburg, not a million miles from OR Tambo Airport. And the ironic thing was it was after hours they were being taught, but only because the teacher was interested. Yeah. Secondly, the kids who wanted to go, they had to travel long distances, they had problems getting home afterwards.
Absolutely.
It's a terrible irony, but this fourth industrial revolution thing, I mean, how is corporate companies like yourself, multinationals, how are you tackling it here in Africa?
So, I mean, we are investing in robotics. We're looking at, drones, drone technology to deal with the supply chain infrastructure deficits that I was talking about. But I think at a fundamental level, we need to be engaging with policymakers to overhaul education. I think it really starts with education. And we talked about the youth population, and if we're really going to exploit the demographic dividend that we all talk about, then it really needs to start with education. And that whole mindset around education needs an overhaul, a complete overhaul. Otherwise, we are not going to be leveraging the opportunities that are right in front of us.
I mean, that's one of the great ironies of this whole thing. I mean, my children, probably the same as yours, they taught about the French Revolution, this kind of stuff. It's all very nice, but it's not going to, I always say, it's not going to help you much, is it, in the outside world? Shouldn't they be taught how to code and how to, that sort of stuff? I mean, when you think that I think sometimes the world is a step behind in the fact people are still expected to be like civil servants and teachers and get jobs for life and that sort of stuff. I don't know. I mean, what do you think?
This talks to the paradigm shift that Zuki mentioned. We need to think differently about the challenge here. If we don't reconfigure ourselves very quickly, we'll miss it. We'll definitely miss a trick. We've got the technology to do massification of skills development. It's not that you have to go to push everyone through school in the same way that you used to think about it. You now can, you roll out technology that gives people access to coding programs in their schools and so forth. They can deliver it using technology, deliver the lessons using technology, but we've got to move quickly. We're not moving. I mean, we've got a commission here, and they set up this fourth industrial commission. It's being seen as a for some reason more of a mobile technology type thing. If you look at the composition and so forth, which is mind-boggling in terms of the possibility of one, slowing down action, because it's been a year now since they announced it. But each year you miss, it's almost like 2 years falling behind because it doesn't work linearly. There's very little action that I've seen coming out at this point in time. In the rest of Africa, there's a couple of really great cases like the Rwanda and so forth, where they've really adjusted their country to exploit opportunities. The rest of the continent, or a majority of the continent, has not yet moved quick enough to skill the children for the future, for how things are going to be. And by the way, there's this fear, and I know it's a slightly different topic, there's this fear that the fourth industrial revolution is going to lead to job losses, right? So maybe there's a tentativeness around the rate at which you adopt the technology and so forth. And yes, there is an element of truth, but more importantly, there's going to be jobs displacement.
Yeah.
Right? Not necessarily losses. And if you can understand that concept and you can see which jobs will be displaced, which ones will be created, and you develop policy to support and exploit the opportunity in that way, then you're off to at least to a good start.
Especially among the unions. I mean, they're very vociferous against it, saying it's going to be job losses, it's going to cut pay, etc., etc. But I don't know. I mean, it's like the thing when once, you know, horses and carts were done with, and cars came in, it created a whole new raft of jobs.
Exactly.
But I don't know. What do you say as an entrepreneur, Zuki?
I think, you know, just to pick up the point that Theo was raising, this fear of job losses, we have to have an open conversation about it and bring all stakeholders to the table. I'm more solution driven. So, for example, there should be a lot more pressure on the CETAs, for example, to say, let's identify the sectors that are going to be impacted and let's go to the lowest level of understanding which jobs exactly. So if you look at retail, for example, the cashiers will become affected when you move to technology-based and you know, and use the technology throughout that value chain. What are the CETAs doing to empower the cashiers, or if you look at banks, what is Bank CETA doing to actually empower tellers who may be affected and reskill them for jobs that will be relevant in future?
Right.
Those are the kind of conversations that we should be having to manage that risk. And I look at Kenya, comes to mind. Ghana to a certain extent. Rwanda is an excellent example where they have been intentional about investing in fintech, you know, being ahead, you know, and looking at certain sectors like tourism, and they've grown. So those are case studies on this continent. There's no need for us to look abroad. So what's stopping us from implementing those successes that they've achieved here in SA? And I would challenge South Africa. I mean, we have all the opportunity in the world. We should be leapfrogging in every aspect on this continent. And we should be driving all of this. And we're not.
I mean, as we were saying earlier, I mean, in Rwanda, people are delivering medicine and all kinds of things by drones, which is not quite the case here. But what other technological advances we'd like to get, do you think?
So, you know, I can give another example. For instance, like with robotic surgery. I think if we don't have, so we are investing, for instance, in robotic surgery. But if surgeons, for instance, are not trained in how to use these technologies, then it reduces the market attractiveness for investing in that. So, you know, it speaks to the reskilling that we were just talking about now. So I think that the more ready we are to accept such technologies, the more attractive it makes it for companies to invest in our markets. So we need to be thinking about it from that perspective. And I think policymakers need to be made aware of that fact. So that they can start looking at the reskilling aspect, and coming back to the point of education, it starts at that level. And we need to start as early as possible to make sure that our market readiness is where it's supposed to be.
Well, on that hopeful note, that's where we finish this World Economic Forum, Road to Cape Town. We'll all be down there next week. CNBC Africa will be covering every step of the way. Thank you very much to my guest, Theo Sabia of Atikani, Kirti Nasai of Johnson & Johnson, and Zuki Siotula, an entrepreneur with an MBA, who's also a WEF Young Global Leader. We'll all see each other next week, and thank you very much for joining us. And from me, Chris Bishop, it's goodbye.